you thunder word. Every now exists in consciousness, but consciousness is amorphous, an emergence of self in all. Walt Whitman's separate person, swirled with solids and liquids, roots, quadrupeds, birds. When the spirit moved on the waters, its first commands were three: divide, 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 light from darkness, a distinguishing firmament, and beneath, land from seas. How can our now but cleave into shows of self and world, a fused complementarity, the great I am and the small? Begin with the small. I was born in 1916, when the explosion of modernity seared Earth's soul with the tanks and machine guns, shells and gas of trench warfare. I reached creative awareness as the totalitarian takeovers, Mussolini's, Huey Long's, Stalin's, swelled to Hitler's. Such the context of my 1936 Atlantic crossing in Delta Return. I set my face to the wind, satanic compact. In that Europe, a Wagnerian screamed for thousands. Like a somnambulist, I go the way God has chosen. Clouds to the hunger of storm. I came home to the consequent agony of all that, thus from the half-gods of a 1945 newsreel. Smoky Yanks turned a flamethrower on an embankment. Japs ran out burning. One veered toward the camera, collapsed in a pile 10 yards away. To moans from the audience came the announcer's spruce words: "The little yellow bellies are getting their medicine." Next day, the long and secretly expected bomb fell on Hiroshima. The genie was out of the bottle. The war was at an end. How far from such world explosion, the Huck Finn River of my boyhood haunts, the side and stern wheelers still plying the oxbow bends. And at dusk, from a floating log, I have seen them go flickering down and down, bright bearers of cotton, into those mirrored glooms. Though in the time of my grandparents that South, and North too, had pioneered precursive war, in which the Southern grandfather had fought, the Northern one, who would come down the river later, seems to have battled only if challenged with his fists. We see him, the old photographer, who would die before I was born, in mystical conversation with himself. He had practiced his art before the Civil War in the Ohio Basin with an earlier family. When that broke up, he worked, after the war, with a portable studio up and down the Mississippi, until in a Kentucky River town he won that child beauty, come with a rose for her portrait, as Fra Lippo Lippi finished his novitiate model with the picture, took her down to Greenville, and set up house and studio. The elemental polarity that flexes my now had an inverse origin in that family. The gentle old photographer becomes the yielding mystery of air and water, his wife the hardness and drive of rock and fire. How could a son, my father, but love more the impractical dreamer with his musing smile and art, love but not imitate, his life ambitions formed by the mother's demonic will? Two photographs from his teens through his 20s take him from the art ideal of the father, his college hopes of being a scholar, thinker, writer, to the mother's pragmatic claim, lawyer, politician, called home by family debt to an ultimately luckless race for power. Now his elements are earth and fire. He searches the state, country, even abroad, and chooses sylph and ondine memory of a dreaming father, my nature mystic mother, costly for him, but for the protagonist of the married land, just the disposition of male and female romantic theory called for. Let a snapshot of me from the summer of 1947, when I was showing symbolic history at Black Mountain College with a 1935-6 portrait of my brother before he went to Sewanee, knit up the argument of generative dipoles. What speaks here is not simply the androgynous blend, but the subtle order of the blending, from which another contrariety arises. In me, both natures are affirmed, the father force embraced in the mother's transcendental quiet. In my brother, most creatively brilliant of us, her tender sensibility rides and repudiates the father's troubled quest. Here is the house that father's ambition built for a wife who did not require such outwardness. On the banks of what was once Rattlesnake Bayou, it confronts river and slough with the facade of Greece. So I issued from the womb to the antinomies of Delta return. In this night land and by the rising waters we plant homes, kindle fire, and praise in song the death and void of love's return. What pressed from over the levee was such a bore of water as the old photographer snapped in this 1912 break at Panther Forest, a punitive backlash which by 1927, with deforestation of tributary valleys, slopes, ranges, gave Faulkner's Old Man its climactic setting. Climax, too, of a boy's earth wonder. The whole delta, from where the hills recede below Memphis to where they bend back at Vicksburg, and eastward to the Yazoo, a crescent 150 miles long by 60 deep, 1.5 million acres, with Greenville at its center, gone to swirling water. Did heart and mind take sides? Delta returned. God of brown water and sun, you spawned these blacks, brood of your deeper wild, singing its songs, sign of your savage bounty on the land. I slipped to the prow, where the river voiced its life in roaring mouths. Sometimes apocalypse seems the only road to join the avenger, pour this human form out in the blind occult, world of nature, storm. Could even the tragic Greeks hold their templed headlands without sacrificing below to the furies in Python caves? Such the pantheist celebration of Rubens' night nature, such the core of an organic physics I drew from entropic paradox in Iowa, those March thunderstorms of 1944. I walked into the woods and climbed a great oak, clouds boiling above, batteries of lightning bursting around, sat with my shoulder to the twisting trunk and pondered the astonishing world. When I came home, I wrote, all matter, systems, worlds, and living things express the need of energy to buttress against its own decay. In this sense, cosmic history is a heightening and unfolding of the perceptive ambivalence of energy, that its activity is the fall by which it dies, its life in time a transcendence, using and used by the destructive urge. That house of mine, trying to uphold through world storm and on such a floodplain our always threatened heritage, as of Greece and Rome, lodged in Christianity and revived through Renaissance to the European plateau of thought, art, and vision, law, conduct, humor, the cultural polyphony I am fated to bring together and celebrate in these shows. Palladio, with the voice overlappings of Gibbon's Ah, Dear Heart, sung almost 60 years ago by the London madrigalists, though with more sensitivity than any recording since. Then the wonder of Inigo Jones' English adaptation, The Queen's House in Greenwich, 1616 to 35. With its south-facing loggia, a harmony reaching down the centuries, in Starhead Park, this sylvan pantheon over the lake. Or, for an interior, the Marble Hall of Holcombe. How that classical resolve assumes, as it nears our time, the retrospection of a lost cause. My symbolic history house, flutings of freedom, cloud pillars of our science, heaved like a frog over media bogs, these united snakes of slogan capitalism, as if to turn Spengler's Untergang, Jeffo's dance of the dream-led masses down the dark mountain, into a cosmic celebration. A house so arched and shadowed by its oaks, it was easier to drop assignments, steal out, and swing the night branches. Once, as my friend Haydock depicts from Delta Return, by throwing acorns at passing cars to fetch the cops. The search beam took me. "Hey, boy, come down." My answer was a leap. Beneath the moon I swung the tree's great circle and dropped to the ground. Curious, this lighted aerial clasps a twig fit to support a grasshopper, where the dark alter ego, shadowed but on no surface, grips a solid limb. Child of Revolt is the title, and yet that book constructs on the delta floodplain a poetic triangle of 3 times 5 to the 5th power. Inside the house, our library, about the size of this showy room in the Brighton Royal Pavilion, but nobler, our space lined all around with books in glass-faced mahogany cases, those limited editions of authors American, English, Continental, with translations from Greece and Rome, Burton's Arabia, a sprinkling from as far as India, China, Japan. Though even the Prince Regent might have offered a sounder base for culture than the plantation backdrop of the Delta scene, 1936, such a planter group as I would drive my father to in the Depression, between the flood and dust, sit in an oven car by a clapboard store, while he talked, encouraged, farmed the claims, himself the most in debt, and the life dream torn by politicians and a failing farm, private loss and Hitler, our world betrayal. At night I have seen him, when he could not sleep, sit up in bed to light his pipe, the weak flame rising and falling like the pulse of his hope, while across the Mississippi the great brown clouds of dust came rolling in, driven with migrant workers from the plains. Our folk plural of children had always been the black one, chulun. These refugees gave it a drawling whine. "Miss Bale, you going to bring the churn?" Thus, to the problem of African blacks, torn from jungle cultures, this bronze king of Ife, through slavery and emancipated poverty to sharecropper bondage, 80% of the population of the Delta living half-literate and in a flux of Maoris the master culture feared, though they were lovable and with a rhythm of soul music art attested from their origins. To that problem was added now the Depression influx of rednecks and po whites, hating those blacks and competing with them in a stalled economy. Such the alluvium on which one had thought to build, like a columned house, Western culture, sonnets, democracy, and madrigals. There, The wartime Halloween of 1916, I came into residence, while the circus carts passed our house, rumbling from the train to the south field, and my sister, almost 2, being apprised of her baby brother, squealed, "See the elephants!" as in the circus of Delta Return, the swaying elephants and caged lions and curtained vans with the still sleeping stars. Here is my cheerful state, perhaps a year and a half after. My first memory cannot be from much later, since, as in the picture, I can just, by propping myself on my arms and shoulders, lean over and stare, it is late at night, into the flushed toilet of my mother's bathroom. The experience is not at all scatological, but cosmic. What I see is a foaming vortex, clue to a book of knowledge quest of tornadoes, whirlpools, spiral nebulae. Surely it was the wonder of science which so imprinted my consciousness. Leonardo, the sea at Piombino, all foaming water. That 20-volume book of knowledge worked my first hypnosis by image and by word. Its illustrations from astronomy, geology, evolution, physics fired the reading of my earliest years. Could an heir to war and violence be unmoved by this double page of earthquake and volcano? Or one already swayed to the romantic capture of time past in time present, not take up the earth dream, inspired by Leonardo, of these 6 panels where ichthyosaur and his Mesozoic ambience are fossilized for modern recovery? I hardly felt the reality of stories until the river and cave exploits of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn gave my own such hankerings deeper than life imperative. And when I came to art, how could my thought not translate Homer's northern watercolor of a boatman to a mythic convergence of Mark Twain's Missouri and my own delta sculling on our Oxbow Lakes, Washington, Lee, and Bolivar? Next, my 2.5-inch refractor, through years of book-guided sky search, affirmed my organic existence and containment in a form-building cosmos of galaxies, suns, worlds in space, revelational backdrop for a planet run amok. Also from that reading I grappled, before 1933, with the complementarity of light as particle and wave, a creative antinomy central to my thought, action, being, spring of that Odyssean many-mindedness our now requires of us for global sailing, as between Charybdis and Scylla. Of course, we went to the movies Saturday afternoons, though not even the horror films, Dracula and Frankenstein, took me like the river, earth, and sky. Had I been a painter, I would hardly have shown the paramount, as Hopper did, magically commonplace, nor with Walker Percy, who joined my school and grade in junior high, have named my first book The Moviegoer, though between his certification and those repetitions by which a segment of lapsed time can be savored of itself, Walker, like Proust, fragments of existence removed outside the realm of time, has hypnotized duration as I would hypnotize the now. Before going to the University of Virginia in the fall of 1933, I spent much of the summer at the Chicago Century of Progress World's Fair. For a Greenville dealer, I would drive old cars up and new ones back, staying between times a week or so at the Y for 50 cents a night. What had polarized my thought for years, the promise of science and breakdown of depression, peaked in the exposition and unemployment of that dynamic city. Homeless bums, beggars, apple polishers, what a come-down after futuristic dreams. Science seemed to suggest a rational solution. My last year in high school, I had won first prize in the state with my own oration on what Roosevelt had called the forgotten man, that blight on America, from northern cities to the tenant farms of AG's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, with Walker Evans' haunting photographs. My speech was the manifesto of a socialism I thought I had invented, all men to work and share. But the apocalyptic rhetoric of its close, those eagles of freedom stormed down in the world and intestine broils of a lost democracy, pointed like the storm forces of the science I loved, rather to a tragic outcome. It was at Virginia that the question of civilization, up or down, anabolic or catabolic, would be pressed. At Jefferson's University, noblest monument of neoclassic in the world, reared against democratic erosion, Hamilton's bank, heightening inequalities until we would come to eat one another as they do in Europe. Education was Jefferson's answer, his plan for free schools of selective excellence to go down before Jackson's egalitarian same for all. And still the democratic poles remain unbridged, unstated, basic instruction for all, not to preclude the public training of a creative elite. At Virginia, I encountered Stringfellow Barr, on the left here, with Scott Buchanan. Upset by the cyclical determinism of his history lectures, I went up and tried to argue with him, advancing against Spengler the science and architecture of the century of progress with the new and thrilling art of the color organ, merely the plus side of my Chicago conflict. In 3 minutes, he turned the exposition to the commercial pastime of a late civilization, its shoddy structures like Alexandrian pleasure pavilions. As for the color organ, he said, it's a fad, but Bach is real, Beethoven is real. He concluded, you can't argue about history unless you know the artifacts. So I had to know them. By making the dean's list, I was freed from classes. I took up art in the library, music in the music room. This old kingdom Kafir I fixed to my wall, a serenity to be marveled at, as hawthorns of the great stone face. The older composer Barr had mentioned was Bach. From the B minor Mass, take the credo, with the mighty ground bass tread. Pose Barr's question, does modernity offer such transpersonal individuation within the wholeness of common faith? Go to the counterpole, Akhenaten of the new empire, here from the colossal sandstone in Cairo. And since the later composer cited was Beethoven, why not sound a personal phrase, the mystical beklemmt? Anguished. From the soaring cavatina of the Opus 130 quartet. Though closer to us, Akhenaten's sensuous soul hunger did not reach my wall. Perhaps I felt I could supply that yearning myself. Hardly the Homeric distance of Kafir's old kingdom. Already I was caught in the stretch of what I had thought to argue. But could our music over 85 years, exhibit what Egyptian art had spread over 1200, the shift from epic celebration to introspective spiritual quest. Clearly, in symbolic history, I had a life work before me. And now, by luck, I won a scholarship to Oxford, changed fields from physics to English, and spent my vacations on the art-rich continent. The old polarity our house had reared over the floodplain assumed the form I would articulate in a Delta poem. Domes and spires of Oxford through the cloud, taking an aureole light in the meadowed land, or upland wheat fields of Bavaria, clean stands of fir under mountain snows, or down those mountains south to the heart's best home, nest of the migrant wings, the Tuscan town, and singing towers of the western dawn. But that poem ends with the periodic Delta return. As I come back that evening, stood alone over this landing on the levee's crown, west the wide river Venus and the moon, and east 3 lighted blocks in the Delta's dark, I felt the strangeness of being localized by an accident of birth to be held and hold this poor spot of earth on the turbulent flood, a center always of the wheeling stars. For my brother had killed himself, and I had come to pass the summer with my parents. Again Delta return. At your death I was abroad. I crossed the ocean to a sad home. A grief unhoused, as from beyond the tomb, settled upon me. Here one of his last watercolors, a feminine yet phallic soul freed, like a bird from the hand. Against it I risk the almost opposite symbol I then drew and colored, bound to life, as inscribed from King Lear, bound on a wheel of fire, tears like molten lead. That fall, Oxford claimed me with new force. Gothic, though I had not yet discovered the music, became the flame center, that lightning of stone, which in the well house of Malbronn Cloister joins the